Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Stan Veuger. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. I'm delighted to host this event on the present and future of international corporate taxation. Warm welcome as well to our online viewership. For our online viewers, please submit your questions to beatrice.lee@aei.org or via Twitter with hashtag AskAEIEcon. As you see, Gerassimos Thomas is not here yet. He's in the car, on his way, in real time from the Treasury Department. He'll be joining us shortly. So for our panelists, if you have bad things to say about the European Commission, now is the time. Do it before he walks in. Anyway, 4 years ago, I moderated a panel discussion on international corporate tax that featured, among others, Gerassimos' predecessor as Director General for Taxation and Customs Union at the European Commission. Back then, the big new idea in international corporate taxation was the digital service tax. It was alleged by some, implied by others, that those taxes were a tool to force breakthroughs in the space more broadly. Now, remarkably, a year ago, over 130 countries agreed to a new framework for the taxation of large multinational firms. The framework, as my colleague Carl Pomerleau will explain in more detail, rests on two so-called pillars. Pillar one sets new rules for the allocation of profits to market jurisdictions, basically based on sales, while Pillar two introduces a global minimum tax. Disagreements within and between countries that signed on to the agreement have delayed its implementation so far. Here in the US, the recent Inflation Reduction Act made significant changes to the corporate tax code, but did not include the full-fledged two-pillar approach. So today our task is to assess where matters stand and how they may and how they should evolve. The proceedings will unfold as follows. First, we'll hear from our four panelists. First, we'll hear from Carl Pomerleau, who's a senior fellow here at AEI. He studies federal tax policy. Before joining AEI, Carl was chief economist and vice president for economic analysis at the Tax Foundation. We'll then go to either Gerassimos, if he arrives in time, or Kathy. Kathy Schultz is vice president for tax and fiscal policy at the Business Roundtable. Before joining the Business Roundtable, Catherine was the vice president for tax policy at the National Foreign Trade Council for almost 15 years. Before that, she was a principal at Capital Strategies Group and a tax director at WorldCom, among other roles. Gerassimos Thomas is Director General for Taxation and Customs Union at the European Commission. His immediate prior role was a Deputy Minister for Environment and Energy in the Greek government. So if you have complaints about energy prices in Europe, he is your man. Prior roles at the Commission include Deputy Director General for Energy, Head of Cabinet for Commissioner Joaquin Almunia, and Director at the DG ECFIN. Finally, Seth Hanlon, here in the middle, is a senior fellow at Center for American Progress, where he focuses on federal tax and budget policy. Prior to rejoining American Progress, is now American Progress or is it Center for American Progress? I feel like there's been a rebranding.
Is the C3 plus the C4.
I see.
Center for American Progress is the C3.
I see.
So, yeah.
Enjoy it both.
I'm here in a C3 capacity.
I see. Good.
So, okay.
All right. No, just wanted to make. Because I was a little unclear on the branding, but now I understand. Prior, he served as special assistant to the president for economic policy at the White House National Economic Council. He also served as senior tax counsel for the House Budget Committee Democratic staff and tax counsel for Senator Debbie Stabenow, senior finance committee member. With that, I'm going to give the floor to Kyle. After everyone's opening remarks, we'll have a conversation among ourselves here in the room. We'll take some questions, including from the internet, and then we should be done by 2:30, if not a bit earlier. With that, Kyle, please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Stan. As Stan mentioned, I'm going to try to set the stage here by providing just a brief overview of where we are and where we've been over the last about year with the global minimum tax, just so we all have a common understanding before we jump into all these acronyms. So Stan mentioned in October of 2021, countries in the OECD's inclusive framework endorsed an outline that would change the way multinational corporations would be taxed. The outline corresponded with the work that done by the OECD in previous years. It would include two main rules or components or pillars, as they call them, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1, it would reallocate a portion of profits earned by large multinationals roughly from their source or where the profits are located with plant and equipment to more something based on destination or where their consumers are. Pillar 2 would enact a global minimum tax regime, and it has several pieces. So the first piece is an income inclusion rule, which would tax foreign profits at a minimum rate of 15%. A second piece, which is called the undertax payments or profit rule, which would apply to cross-border payments and is meant as a backstop to the income inclusion rule. And then a third piece, which is the qualified minimum domestic top-up tax, or the QDMT. This tax would allow domestic authorities first bite at low-tax profits earned in their jurisdictions and would apply before the income inclusion rule or the undertaxed profits rule would apply. And then there's another piece, the subject to tax rule, that was also thrown in there. Pillar 2 is roughly based on the reforms passed in the 2017 Tax Reform Act here, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This law enacted, as many are familiar, a couple big changes to the tax regime impacting multinationals. It enacted the Global Intangible Low Tax Income, or GILTI, which applies up to a 13.125% tax on foreign profits of U.S. multinationals. It enacted Foreign-Derived Intangible Income, FDII, which provides a reduced tax rate on certain export incomes of 10.5%. And third, the Base Erosion Anti-Abuse Tax, or BEAT, which applies to it's a minimum tax that applies to multinational corporations meant to prevent outbound profit shifting. Now, while the deal was being negotiated at the global stage, in the United States, President Biden entered office with campaign proposals to move closer to Pillar 2. These reforms would have expanded the base of GILTI, raised the rate to roughly 15.8% or higher, depending on the treatment of the foreign tax credit. It also would have reformed or replaced BEAT with another acronym, SHIELD. And the reason for these reforms were, one, primarily to raise revenue for domestic spending, but also to move in the direction of Pillar 2, although I think we'll get into why these reforms were not exactly the same as Pillar 2. Most of Biden's proposals or variations of the proposals were included in the Build Back Better Act that was voted on in the House of Representatives. However, Congress ultimately failed to pass the Build Back Better Act. Now, Congress did ultimately pass something that did change corporate tax policy. The Inflation Reduction Act included a 15% minimum tax on large corporations. However, confusingly, this is a different tax regime altogether. It looks more like a corporate alternative minimum tax on book income rather than something that is like Pillar 2. And what about Pillar 1? Well, it got a lot less public consideration in the United States. It was not included in any legislation, and that's probably because lawmakers were somewhat realistic that it wasn't going to happen this time around. Most people accept that it would require changes to treaties, which need more than that. 50 votes for reconciliation would need 67 votes, far more than the Democrats had to pass any major changes to tax policy. Now, where are we now? Global minimum tax in the United States is effectively stalled. GILTI reforms are not really going anywhere in the next couple of months. And if the Republicans take the House and the Senate, it may be years before the issue is revisited. And it's unclear how the global minimum tax deal will come together in other countries.
Thank you so much, Kyle. I think that gives us a good sense of where the international process has been over the past few years, where things stand here in the United States. And with perfect timing, we have with us Director General Thomas, who has arrived and is now can give us a perspective from Europe on where things stand, where things have been over the past few years, and where they will and should be moving in the next few years. Welcome, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and apologies for the slight delay. We had meetings at the IMF, and the traffic is causing some problems, so I apologize to all the participants for being a bit late. I think if I heard well, you made a full description of the history, and I think where we can take it from here is that we have the way we view the situation in Europe is that on the so-called Pillar 2, we have an agreement, we have the model rules, and we are in the process of taking them, bringing them into force, enacting them into legislation, and there has been very fast progress in producing European legislation that will bring Pillar 2 into law in Europe. The approach we have taken in Europe is sort of what I would describe for non-experts. I suppose you are not Brussels bubble experts, so it is a two-step approach. So we have first what we call a European directive, that it is agreed by everybody, and the text therefore is agreed under EU law, and then this text is then transposed into national law by each individual member state, but it is exactly the same text. So this is the approach that we took in Europe, and the text was proposed in December 2021, and then it was the actual text has been agreed in June last year. It was stable as of April, but formally, let's say, the current version is agreed by all member states, and the text is stable since April. Now, what has happened is that for reasons unrelated to the substance of the text, we need unanimity in order to formally adopt this text, and this has been now since June. It's a bit blocked in the voting by one member state, which there are some discussions in parallel, and we hope that the text will actually be adopted before the end of the year, and then this will give enough time for the text to be adopted and under national law, and come into force as of the 1st of January 2024 or 31st of December 2023, as we say. Now, I'm sure that you read in the newspapers, what will happen if, let's say, this one member state who does not have disagreements on the text, but they do not want to vote it for the time being, they want to vote it later. I think the situation in Europe is developing, that in a scenario where there are two different ways, but the outcome is the same. Either the rest of the member states with some kind of different procedure that I can elaborate. We call it enhanced cooperation, but I can elaborate if you are interested in the nitty-gritty. They can adopt the same text again in this two-step process. So it will adopt it first among the majority of countries and then enacted into national law, or it can be adopted directly by the member states into national law, the same text, and by a large number of countries. And we have statements already by European countries that have, let's say, politically valid to use one of the two alternatives, that both are legal and have the same effect when it comes to companies. So the commitment in Europe on Pillar 2, it is very real. It will unfold, let's say, there is room to have let's say, political compromises that, I repeat, do not involve changes in the text of the agreement. All the countries, 27, including the one has not so far voted for the text, they agree with the text. And therefore, I think we will have, in time for the end of next year, we will have Europe ready to implement Pillar 2. Then when it comes to, of course, on Pillar 2, there are a number of issues that still need to be discussed in terms of, in the implementation and clarified. And I think there is time to do that, and there is time to do it in a consistent way. And we are working with all the signatories of the agreement, the other countries, but of course also the US, to do that within the framework of the existing model rules. And on Pillar 1, there are technical discussions that are discussed, that continue. The calendar for having the treaty ready for signature next June has been confirmed in the latest technical discussions, and the texts will be ready, in the spring next year. So it's an important engagement for the EU and the EU member states in that regard. And of course, we are here both engaging with the private sector a lot in the US and elsewhere. The preparedness of the private sector is an important ingredient of success. The views of the private sector in the public consultations, and I think there is one important positive from this, let's say, so-called delay of the Pillar 1, let's say, readiness of the treaty. It moved from last summer to next summer, and I think this allowed, and we insisted very much as European Union and put a lot of emphasis that the OECD would benefit by getting through these different public consultations the possibility to get the insights of the private sector and have, let's say, the necessary ingredients that will allow us to have a global deal. I think the last thing I would say for the EU, it is important to find agreement, of course, with within the EU, the most important countries, the US, the developed countries, but it is important that it remains a global agreement that provides predictability, to companies that are by their nature working across the globe. That's very important for us. The second is that I think it's even more important to look at the global picture, given the changing geopolitical situation, that it is creating new incentives and disincentives for redesign of supply chains. And I think that is important, that we do not have only an agreement that it is, between EU and US, but I think the global nature of the, OECD agreement is very important ingredient. It requires, like every global agreement, certain compromises, but I think in this geopolitical framework, I think it is important that we pay attention to this. So, looking forward to see how this matches. There is a little bit of, I would say, there is a bit of a risk of a disengagement of the private sector, and that would be bad if the private sector does not remain fully engaged in making it work in the implementation. And, well, we will see, of course, the results of the US election, and this has any impact on this agreement. Now, you did mention in your, I heard the last IRA, I think there are certain elements that you highlighted, but certainly the IRA is not a reform of GILTI, and does not, eventually we need a GILTI reform. It's one of the components of the pillar, like many other components that, need to go through in order to have a successful pillar 2.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you highlighted private sector engagement, because we are about to enjoy some private sector engagement. Kathy, how about you? You give the perspective from the business community.
I don't have the same optimism that Gerassimos has about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. From the business community, not only from the business community perspective, but looking at the documents that have been coming out of the OECD has released several progress reports in the last couple of months. We had a progress report on Amount A of Pillar 1, and we just recently had another progress report on tax certainty and administration. These are very long documents, but if you read the documents, they're put together by the OECD Secretariat, and at the very beginning it says these are not documents that everyone has agreed to that is part of the inclusive framework. So you have 141 countries who have signed on to this, but as they're working through their difficulties, they're putting out some documents so that you can see what kind of progress they are making. I wouldn't say that these are encouraging. If you start to read through them, there are quite a number of footnotes that say some countries agree to this, other countries agree to that. In some cases, we've had some decent discussions on how and where those disagreements are. Pretty clearly that there is a disagreements between some of the OECD and countries in the US and developing countries on very specific issues. Disagreements on how taxes are generally thought of and how they intend to administer the taxes and what their abilities are. Just for an example, one of the points of contention that is out there right now is that companies who are already paying taxes in countries where they have boots on the ground, they have facilities, they have employees, they would like to be sure that the taxes that they're currently paying in a jurisdiction are taken into consideration when the taxes that are going to be reallocated are looked at and says, okay, we're already paying taxes here. How much additional taxes will be required to be allocated to this market? Part of the taxes that are being discussed are withholding taxes. Are withholding taxes part of taxes that a company is paying within a jurisdiction or not? If they are, then companies feel that they should be given credit for all the taxes they're paying, like the total taxes they're paying within a jurisdiction, so that those taxes are all counted. The developing countries have taken a position that withholding taxes should not be included in the taxes that are counted against all the taxes that a company is paying. This seems like a compromise position that some people may be able to work out the differences, but during the last public consultation on September 12th in Paris, the representative who was testifying for the developing countries from South Central said that if withholding taxes are included in the total amount of taxes that companies are considered to have paid under this system, that is a line in the sand that they're not willing to cross. So you have the US that says withholding taxes must be included in the taxes the companies are going to be granted for paying in that country, and the developing country saying if they are, then we won't agree to how this is going to come together. So there's a lot of tension that is already in the system. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the fact that the US Treasury has been working with this, but that it may be a very difficult tax treaty issue for the Senate to be able to deal with. Unless some of these inherently difficult issues can be resolved as part of the Pillar 1 discussions between the delegates who are already at the table, we may not get to a point where there is an agreement that the US Senate will even have to consider. We have a lot of different discussion points on how much profit should be shared. There's differences on definitions. One of the things that Pillar 1 is supposed to do for the business community is to eliminate unilateral measures. And if we have a Pillar 1 agreement to reallocate income, countries will eliminate their unilateral measures. We have not seen a definition of what those unilateral measures are and what all is to be included in that. It is assumed that it will be digital service taxes, but there are a lot of other taxes that countries have applied to companies that companies believe should be part of the unilateral measure discussion, such as the UK diverted profits tax. There are equalization levies. There are a number of other royalty and withholding issues that are now coming up. And so far, we have not seen anything from the OECD on an agreement on what those unilateral measure definitions will be. How that is resolved is critical for business support. If business feels like they're going to be subject to a reallocation of profits and still subject to what we consider unilateral measures, then we're getting double taxed in many cases on some of the same income. And there's a big concern about how that double tax will be relieved. When you look at the documents that were put in last week on tax certainty and tax administration, it is clear that how double tax relief is going to be provided has not yet been agreed to. There's supposed to be a binding arbitration provision, but how that is designed and who the arbiters are supposed to be and what the time frame is going to be is very clear in the footnotes that there is disagreement on how this is coming together. So as Pillar 1 is moving through the process, it is getting harder and harder to see how the countries who are at the table discussing this are going to be able to reach an agreement. Someone said that, everybody expects Pillar 1 to die. I think it's going to go into a coma. The biggest concern of the business community is that if Pillar 1 is not adopted, we will see more unilateral measures that are going to be much more robust and very different from what we have seen as part of digital service taxes. We're concerned that countries will use Pillar 1 to extrapolate different pieces of this to determine what they want to do on another type of unilateral measure that might get them away from a potential retaliation by USTR. I mean, we had digital service taxes. USTR put some 301 cases to say these are discriminatory taxes against the US. They have all been withdrawn. The digital service taxes are all on hold while we discuss Pillar 1. But if Pillar 1 if they are unable to reach agreement within the inclusive framework on Pillar 1, we believe we're going to see additional measures that will come up that will try to be non-discriminatory and get around the digital service tax problem that we have seen in the past. And so we are concerned about what we're going to see in the international tax system. We are already starting to see it. Some countries are already working around how they're going to look at digital service taxes and try to find alternative measures to be able to tax companies in a different way. I know Poland has some, Colombia has some. They're already starting to come into effect. So for Pillar 1, Amount A, there's still a long way to go. The second part of Pillar 1 was something called Amount B. Amount B was supposed to give some sort of clarity on transfer pricing and to make it so that transfer pricing cases can be resolved in a more efficient manner than they have been in the past. Amount A is sort of the stick and Amount B is supposed to be the carrot. It's supposed to give companies some sort of assurances that they're not going to go into long audit periods and have long transfer pricing audits. We have seen nothing on Amount B. We are supposed to see some sort of draft document by the end of this year. But as they're trying to move forward with the time frame of putting something together by mid-2023, we don't have agreement on Pillar 1. We haven't even seen anything on Amount B, and there's still no consensus among the participants on exactly how this is going to come together. So for Pillar 1, I would say that I am, like I said, I think it's going to go into a coma for a while. I don't know how they're going to be able to resolve these differences, but the fact that certain countries are starting to draw lines in the sand make it more difficult to see how compromise can be reached if they're starting to back off and say, if it's not my way, we're walking away from this. So whether or not we can get to a Senate that can start to look at this is unclear. I know that there's been a lot of pressure on the business community to say, we should be supportive of Amount A, of Pillar 1, because without that, we're going to get unilateral measures. Because we are concerned about the way it's being developed, we are concerned that we will get, if there was anything that would revive Pillar 1, we would get a combination of that plus additional unilateral measures. And we see no positives in that. I mean, we look at that and say, this is supposed to stop chaos in the international tax system, and this does not appear to be heading in that direction. On Pillar 2, the global minimum tax. The last that the business community had an opportunity to add anything into Pillar 2 was in 2019 when we had a blueprint on Pillar 2 that we had a public consultation on. This was before Everything shut down for COVID. Then we saw the model rules come out on Pillar 2, and business had no input into these. And we saw some very different things than were in the blueprint that took us in a different direction. As Kyle mentioned, we had the QDMTT, which is a sort of a minimum tax that a country can put into place to make sure that any additional taxes that are collected stay within their country. So that if any company is within that country and they have that 15%, then that country gets first dibs on that money. On the UTPR, it was originally a undertaxed payment rule. It is now an undertaxed profit rule. So if a US company has a total effective tax rate under 15%, technically any place where they have CFCs or subsidiaries, those other countries could top up that tax to that 15%. So if the US has a tax incentive, such as R&D tax credit, and companies use that and can lower their taxes, other countries can then take some of that additional money and add it to the subsidiaries within their jurisdiction to get it to the 15% that is not being made in the US. This was not originally part of the plan. I think that the business community was taken aback by the undertaxed profit rule and the fact that the effective tax rate in the US was going to count against how companies are doing business and what their tax rate will effectively be. And so we look at GILTI. It's on a different tax base. It's on an income tax base, not a financial services tax, not a financial book tax, which is what the global rules are. And so we're on a different tax base. We're on a different type of tax system. So GILTI under the model rules is effectively supposed to be considered a CFC, an accepted CFC regime. And there are ordering rules under Pillar 2 that say if you have a QDMTT, the GILTI CFC rules should be under that. But then you have the IIR, and then you have the UTPR. So we have layers of taxes as part of this. Every country can determine how they're going to be able to adopt this, even though the rules are supposed to be uniform. And that some countries have said, yes, they would accept the GILTI as a CFC regime. Other countries said only if GILTI has been changed to a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis will they consider it compatible with the GLOBE rules. So we are in a quandary right now. The implementing rules for Pillar 2 have not yet been released. That should happen by the end of this year. We do have the European countries who are starting to say if we cannot get a majority, then we will adopt this on our own. There are concerns about what will happen with the US bilateral tax treaties with those jurisdictions, because as you look at our treaties, they have rules, there are savings rules, so countries can make some changes to their own underlying domestic law. But how they reach to the US and the ultimate parent entity to tax something when business profits are very specifically dealt with under our bilateral tax treaties to get something from the UTPR is questionable. And there are different opinions as to how our tax treaties will work with individual countries where we have bilateral tax treaties and how that UTPR could be worked. So there are a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. The model rules have a lot of questions that need to be clarified. We hope that the implementing language gives us some clarity on that. But from the business perspective, we have a lot more questions, and we are concerned about how some of these discussions have been taking place and how we are going to proceed to make sure that we are not double taxed and that we have a very strong and robust system for relieving double taxation as part of these systems. But for right now, I don't have the same optimism that Gerassimos has about how the OECD project is moving forward right now.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Before going to Seth, Gerassimos got a little uneasy, I think, during your Pillar 1 pessimism. So
No, I think I agree with a lot with what you said, but I didn't express optimism. I expressed facts, and the Pillar 2 middle rules are approved. So countries are moving ahead to implement them, and there are consequences of this, and there are the European countries have declared the ministers that they will go forward. In Switzerland, they are changing the constitution. So I think there is a different, you don't need to be optimistic or pessimistic when it comes to Pillar 2. The process is at a different stage. On Pillar 1, I think one can look at the process. Nothing has been agreed, and then one can have some prediction as to whether this will be agreed by next year or not. But I think on Pillar 2, we are at a different stage, that countries have prepared and are ready to enact legislation. What you are saying in your intervention is that the way they will move forward, it will have consequences for business. And I think this is true, and therefore it's good that business get prepared for this, because I think it's unlikely that on Pillar 2 we will have nothing happening over the next 2 years.
Okay, very good. So we've had facts and pessimism. I know Seth is a founder of optimism, so let's go to you next.
I'll certainly try. So, I mean, thanks to AEI and for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I think it might be worth just sort of stepping back and, we've discussed a lot of acronyms, specific rules, but like...
I have to say, I guess the OECD acronyms, the QDMTT and UTPR, are definitely lower quality than guilty and beat.
Yes, absolutely. They need to up their acronym game. But I mean, I think it's worth just sort of stepping back and like starting with just remembering what the problem is that all this is, in particular Pillar 2, is trying to solve. And the reality that, for decades now, the largest, most profitable companies in the world have been avoiding globally hundreds of billions of dollars of taxes that should be owed to governments by shifting their profits from the countries in which they actually do business artificially to low tax countries. And so, let's think, why is this a bad thing? So, first, it's that you have the world's most powerful, profitable companies paying, in some instances, single-digit tax rates. It costs countries revenue that is either going to sacrifice investments or is going to force them to rely on other, probably more regressive sources of revenue, and in that sense, widening inequality. And then without a policy response, the problem was getting worse and would continue to get worse. And the reason it would continue to get worse is that just an increased amount of increased share of corporate profits are, derived from intangible assets or, can be moved, right? So, and there's more globalization. So the problem would have been getting worse. So, I mean, I think, anyway, it's just worth stepping back and remembering the problem that we're trying to solve here is a global collective action problem that is a serious one. And so, I mean, I think if we were to take stock, like at this point in time, over the last several years, the United States and the world has made a good amount of progress in solving this collective action problem, but not nearly as much as we could have hoped for by this point. So, obviously last year, major step with more than 130 countries agreeing to the inclusive framework, huge diplomatic success, and I think the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit for it. And just the fact that that many countries, including low tax countries, all kinds, developing countries, and wealthy countries agreed to this statement of principles, I think is significant in and of itself, even though obviously there's lots more work to do. So, I think, to be candid, it was very disappointing after the U.S. had this, and U.S. and the EC and the world had this diplomatic breakthrough that the U.S. did not follow through legislatively, and the U.S. Senate had an opportunity essentially to enact, Pillar 2 for the United States, and pass up that opportunity. So I think that's, obviously it was a major a missed opportunity. To be sure, the IRA itself, I think, is historic, tremendously positive development in solving the much bigger, more important collective action problem of climate change, but it was definitely like disappointing to not have any international reforms in IRA. So it was a missed opportunity. So, I mean, I think, it's easy to see a lot of the challenges, why there's a lot of challenges in moving forward. But I think, if we look back, the process is moving forward in fits and starts. And I think, in IRA, there's of course the adoption of the corporate minimum tax, or corporate profits minimum tax, book minimum tax, whatever we're going to call it. And to be sure, there are big differences between the book minimum tax that was enacted in IRA and what's envisioned in Pillar 2. But the corporate minimum tax that was enacted and that will go into effect in 2023 is a 15% minimum tax on, deriving from a base of book profits with adjustments, to be sure. And it applies to the corporate group globally. It doesn't look at constituent entities, at least for U.S. headed companies. So it does, in its own ways, get at some of the problems of profit shifting. I think it will reduce profit shifting simply because it will be no longer economical if a company is paying that to drive their effective tax rate lower by using profit shifting. So I think that's a big deal. I think it follows on the heels of the United States adopting GILTI and BEAT in 2017, which I've been critical of, but I think lay the basic architecture for and were path breaking in their own right, and lay the architecture for something like Pillar 2. And a real global minimum tax. So, I mean, to sum up, I think it would be better if the United States had enacted the international tax reforms and Build Back Better. But what we've enacted so far has moved in I think, a very positive way. In a lot of ways, has moved further than other countries. And at this point, I mean, it's clearly the next step is not the United States that takes, but other countries, and in particular Europe. And we'll see. We've discussed that the European countries have multiple ways to move forward, most ideally with unanimity. But the finance ministers of the 5 largest EU economies reiterated their commitment to adopt Pillar 2 by all means possible, and so I take them seriously on that. And I think once countries move forward, others will follow. So you will have there's other countries, Japan, Canada. So we'll see. This may play out over a long period of time. It may happen in fits and starts, but I think there's a real chance of progress. And then in the United States, I mean, I think we'll see what happens in the election. It doesn't seem like there's.
I don't think Democrats are going to end up with 67 senators.
Right. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's a great likelihood of legislative action, major legislative action in the near term. But in 2025, we have this sort of major pivot point with our tax code where many both individual provisions expire from TCJA and a lot of corporate provisions come into play or expire. And so, who knows what the politics will be and who's going to be in leading the government by 2025. But there is definitely a clear action forcing events in 2025. So we will see. And I just wanted to make one sort of separate point about IRA, which is that I think one of the most positive and important things in IRA is the money for rebuilding the IRS, which has really been decimated over the last decade and longer than that. And so how does that relate to this conversation? Well, the $80 billion in funding for the IRS. There's been a lot of demagoguery about how that's going to be spent, but the point of it is that the IRS has been completely overmatched and outgunned when it comes to auditing and litigating against the largest companies in the world who have all of the world's top lawyers and accountants and economic expert witnesses and everything available at their disposal to litigate the IRS into submission. So I think and obviously it's for wealthy enforcement with regard to wealthy people, individuals as well. But so if you look at some of these international tax cases and the billions of dollars that are at stake and how long they take, some of the cases take 10 or 15 years to resolve. And, you realize the IRS really has to pick its battles very selectively. So anyway, so I think more resources for the IRS is going to, accomplish the important thing of just applying the law that already exists in a better way.
Kyle, are there things you would like to respond to?
I guess I'll just respond to one thing, and I don't think it's a big disagreement, just something worth emphasizing, just comparing Pillar 2 to the book minimum tax that was passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So it is true that both of these are, roughly speaking, 15% minimum taxes, and they both at least start with financial statement income, but I'd say that that's pretty much the end of the similarities, and then from there, they're quite different. So Pillar 2 is calculated on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, so you can't have companies offsetting low tax income with high tax income throughout the world. The book minimum tax, however, is calculated on a worldwide basis. So the book minimum tax only reduces incentives to profit shift if companies expect at the margin to be subject to the book minimum tax, but they won't always be, so the incentive for profit shifting may still remain. Then the second big difference is threshold. So the book minimum tax is a threshold of $1 billion in net income on financial statements, whereas Pillar 2 has a threshold of 750 million euros and US dollars now in revenue. So it's a much lower threshold. Then there's also the treatment of timing differences. Pillar 2 is designed in a way that timing differences, like accelerated depreciation and other differences, don't trigger tax liability. Now, the book minimum tax, at the very last second, they excluded accelerated depreciation from the book minimum tax, but other timing differences can still trigger tax liability. Then finally, I think the goals of the two policies are different. So the book minimum tax, the goal was to address a perceived issue with companies paying effective tax rates below 15%, much more of a political thing. Well, Pillar 2 is designed to address profit shifting, and you can see it from the way it's designed. It is not on pure financial statement income. There are carve-outs for tangible property, carve-outs for payroll, carve-outs for timing differences to get at what economists call excess returns that could be attributed to shifting profits from one jurisdiction to another. So under Pillar 2, you're not going to get, say, companies paying effective rates of 15%. You're still going to have tax rates that could be 0% or even negative in some years, even with this headline of a 15% minimum tax.
Yeah, so I do think that's a key difference, right? One issue is, are we taxing the companies that we want to tax sufficiently within the US or whatever jurisdiction may be. The other one is really the fight between jurisdictions, which of course, has motivated a lot of this framework and has been in the background of the ongoing discussion. And I do think there, the distinction between the IRA tax base and Pillar 2 is super important, right? Because it's very difficult if you do not have agreement on the tax base to have the kind of agreement on who gets to tax what that I think Kathy was particularly concerned about. And so, given that we do not, if anything, we seem closer on the rate than on the base, which is a little weird because normally you'd think you want to agree on you can't agree on the rate until you know what the base is. And so where do you all think that process is going? If we're not going to have agreement on the base, and Kathy spoke about it a little bit, so maybe Seth or Gerassimos can go first. What do you think over the next 5 years, if there's continued disagreement over over Pillar 1, what are individual countries going to do in response? I think the U.S., of course, has now done its global minimum tax, which you could think of as a unilateral response along those lines. As Kathy pointed out, before the two-pillar framework came to the table, a lot of countries are moving toward digital service taxes. Are we going to see those come back? Some countries, I'm sure, will do that. Is the Commission going to go back to proposing an EU-wide digital service tax? Have the discussions over Pillar 1, as Kathy hinted at, inspired broader unilateral measures? Where do you think that's going to go? And maybe, Seth, you want to go first, and we go to...
Sure. I mean, I guess, I'd say I certainly, agree with what Kyle said about the differences in the base of the tax. I mean, I think with depreciation, there's sort of a similarity with the exemption for normal returns, and there's some flexibility with timing differences, but certainly there's there's obviously big differences with the base of the tax. I just think it's if one compares the book Pillar 2 to the book minimum tax, it's more similar than the difference between Pillar 2 and nothing, right? So that's sort of all I'm saying is that it is a step in that general direction that I think, and I think also, politically at some point could be a bridge to something that looks more like Pillar 2. I mean, I think, I don't know what on Pillar 1, what would happen, like if Kathy said, if the discussions go into a coma. I mean, it seems like there will be inevitably more proliferation of unilateral actions by different countries, and that could revive the discussions from its coma. So, I guess we'll just have to see about that. I mean, of course, that I think it's premature because those discussions are proceeding apace, and hopefully we'll get to the convention by mid next year. And then I don't know. I mean, I guess we've talked about this. This sort of goes to the design of the taxes and the base. I mean, I think there's a lot of focus on the threat, the sort of specter of double taxation, right? And I think it's just important to realize that, over many years.
And you think that's good?
What's that?
And you think double taxation?
I just don't think it's, I'm just saying, double taxation means, it could mean 15% plus 15%, which is taxation at 30%, which is less than the US used to have, right? We just need to put it in perspective, is all I'm saying. It's not good. We should iron these differences out. But we've had a much bigger problem, much bigger problem with double non-taxation over the last several decades. So as we move forward, if there's instances of quote-unquote double taxation, I just think we just need to put those in perspective.
Gerassimos, where do you think?
I think we need to avoid losing sight of the big picture. And this was mentioned both by Kyle and Seth. IRA had a broader objective, to make the U.S. contribute also to the climate change. I think the profit shifting objective of the OECD tax deal is very important. I mean, the crisis that we are going through the war in the Russian war in Ukraine, the shifting in supply chains has brought the US and the EU closer together and committed to multilateral action. I was this morning with Secretary Yellen in the coalition of finance ministers for climate action. 78 countries, are committing, and the finance ministers are committing. They have been working together. They're not, the group was not created now, but they work together in order to deal with the longer-term challenges of our economies. And key component is the private and the public sector to work together globally for energy transition, climate adaptation, climate mitigation. So we need to look outside the domestic politics of the EU or of the US or whatever. The businesses that we deal with are global. They have similar interests between the EU and the US, and I think that has to remain at the top of the agenda. And for finance ministers across the world, and particularly the US and the EU, dealing with the profit shifting, dealing with fairness, dealing with inequalities is a necessary component of our policies. So I think we need to keep that in mind, and this will form the debate of the different and difficult, some of them difficult technical issues. I think we have gone a long way with ups and downs in coming to this global tax deal. On our side, it's not because of undue optimism, and of course I will take into account where the US business is going if we are telling them we are not going anywhere. But so far we have not started thinking of unilateral measures. So if you push us to do unilateral measures, of course you might do that. But I don't think at the EU level we are not going to start this race, and there has been, the statements have been very clear at political level, both at the EU, which is the equivalent to federal level here, at member states. There are certain DSTs that they exist in our member states. They have been frozen. The Commission, we have proposed before, the final stage of the OECD agreement, the more positive engagement. At some stage, we have proposed our own digital levy, which we have frozen, and we think it's not on the top now of the agenda to start taking out, different unilateral measures. We think that it will be, and in particularly what you said, Kathy, about the concerns that you had about unilateral measures that are in other parts of the world, I think it's a concern for us. I mean, as Europe, we want to stop this happening. We think there is a lot of value in working on this deal and making sure among ourselves, but also with the countries like India, African countries, that we avoid a large movement of unilateral measures. But, the geopolitics of this are, this is for all the countries that we speak in Europe, but also outside the world, the geopolitics need government revenue. And, in Europe, we need more revenue to have defense. Everybody needs more revenue and coalition with the private sector for climate change. So this by itself, it gives us an ingredient by which we can sit on the table and make the governments agree on some of these difficult issues that Kathy said and raised in a very pertinent way. They are on the list. This is the reason on Pillar 1 that we didn't have an agreement this summer, but the current, let's say, timetable for resolving some of these issues is being respected. And the fact that, there are a lot of footnotes, I think it's normal, given that we have another 6 months to go. The question is will we approach the issue with a spirit of partnership between the public and the private sector in the different countries, or will approach it without a spirit of partnership? And that is, I think, the issue too. There is a price to pay for having a global agreement. We can see it in terms of administrative burden. We have been vocal about this. There is a certain administrative burden. I think there are also good things of the positive engagement of the private sector. The private sector says, oh, you didn't listen to me, or you didn't consult me, or now that you consult me is too late, I will not respond. Or the private sector can say, yes, this is a good solution. This is a fair solution. We don't need to say the private sector, the German companies in scope on Pillar 1, or the French companies, or the American companies. They are now luckily companies from all over the world. They don't need to say, no, I don't like this. Everyone has something that they don't like. They need to like, this is something that could work for the private sector as a whole, and this would be fair. I think to have a broader agreement has a certain, price, and I think leaders in Europe believe that it is worth price. And I think I have been here for a couple of days, but I met a lot of representatives of the private sector. It is a little bit different. There are less the companies in scope in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 in Europe, but the engagement is more positive. They see more this benefit, the wider benefits that we have. And I am sure this spirit, if it prevails, it will bring solutions for both issues. Now, if we, I think we cannot, I don't predict and I don't want to comment, but if I take the expression of staying in a coma, I think I find it difficult that people will do nothing for 5 years. If this deal does not move forward, other things will happen. They might not be international, they might not be EU, we might not take initiatives at EU level, at the federal level, and every country will do the same. India will do other things, and China will do their other things, and Indonesia and the other countries. I cannot see how this is a better alternative. And of course, the US is a big country. You can close to your domestic environment, and then you can take measures. This is not what the administration is engaged. I think we see an important multilateral engagement by this administration. It's very welcomed around the world. This week are important meetings, and this is confirmed here and there. So I think we need to get the big picture, and I think a lot of the problems are solvable that are on the table. It is not solvable that we will consider guilty equivalent, to Pillar 2. So some kind, and I think this is an important angle. The model rules say how to deal with a non-reformed guilty, and one can discuss this, but one can discuss some components of this, but there are some things that remain there on the table to be dealt with, and there are political decisions.
I received an online question that I think fits this answer quite well, which is how, if at all, does the international tax debate differ from other international collective action problems such as climate change mitigation? I think what you're saying is exactly right? That in the international tax space, every individual country has an incentive to act unilaterally, whereas in the climate change debate, of course, the opposite is true on some level. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I think that's a key distinction. Second question that I wanted to highlight from our online viewership is, what do you all think are the primary barriers for adopting destination-based international tax schemas, such as in Pillar 1? And do you see any way to overcome those barriers? But maybe you see, but what is, I would phrase the question differently, and I would phrase it as, why didn't the countries that were concerned that they were not in a position to capture tax revenue that they thought should be theirs, why didn't they just go after that revenue through indirect taxation, as opposed to going through the DST route, which is very, I think, politically contentious, or through the corporate taxation route? Because you could, and we talked about this briefly before the event, you could just increase your VAT and exempt all kinds of categories and effectively tax digital services more. Why do you think European countries did not go that route? did not go down that route. I feel like that would have been, that would be too transparent to do, but I think in 2018 that would have been a relatively easy solution to some of the concerns. Do you have a sense of why that didn't happen?
I mean, I'm happy to talk about
Yeah.
some of the bad stuff. When you look at indirect taxation, particularly for how companies are already dealing with it around the world, I mean, every multinational has indirect tax people because outside of the US, everybody has a VAT system or GST system. And so companies are used to dealing with this. But the problem is the companies are the tax collector. The end user is the customer. And the customer is the one that's paying the tax, the company's collecting it and turning it in. But the big thing, the difference is, I think that they're trying to get to the company itself, not to the end user. But as you know, with some of the digital service taxes, they still get passed along to the final consumer, and they collect that, and it goes from there. So it's not all that different. It's just this, there's a distinction that countries are making to say, if we do this, that looks like a consumption tax on our consumers, which is hard to add another consumption tax under the current economic situation in most countries. Whereas if you try to go after the companies themselves, they are not voters within those different jurisdictions, and I think it takes it back one step.
So,
I think it's a good way to do it. I think it's probably a more reasonable way to do it, but I think that politically, for the countries that are looking at this, it's a little bit harder because they have to sell it.
and so you're saying basically substantively it would work, but
Yes.
the same thing that would make it internationally more palatable makes it domestically impalatable.
It makes it more difficult for them domestically. The other thing I would like to just add in general is that we keep talking about the fact that we have all these base erosion. The OECD had the original BEPS project that was finished in 2015.
See, that was a better acronym.
And it did. And it had 15 different action items. And one of them, what they were supposed to do is do an economic analysis and then look at it 5 years later to see how much it actually worked. You changed where IP was supposed to be. There were very distinct rules about what companies had to do, and a lot of companies reacted. They changed their rules to make sure that their IP was where they had their product, where they had their facilities. What happened, though, is that was supposed to be reviewed in 2020, and before we even knew if the original BEPS project worked, they automatically started on a different project. It was part of Action Item 1, and there was a task force on the digital economy, because when they looked at it initially, they said you cannot tax the digital economy because the entire economy is becoming digitalized. And so you can't ring fence one piece of that. And so they started this next project, but before they even had the economic analysis to see if the first base erosion project worked, we started on one with the assumption that, well, it must not be working because we think we still need to get more money from these companies, whether or not that has to do with raising additional revenue or changing the international tax rules. But we did have an original BEPS project that was supposed to get to profit shifting, and we don't know what the outcome of that is because I've not seen the final economic analysis as to how those 15 action items have actually played out.
But it then got superseded by the DST discussion, which of course is not really about profit shifting.
Right. But they started to move on this before we even had the analysis to know what the original BEPS did.
So, different question I wanted to ask, and I think Gerassimos is the right person to pose the question to. So, if of the three pathways that you outlined within the European Union toward agreement, so directive, enhanced cooperation, just individual member states enacting changes. Why do you think the directive route is preferable? Is the idea simply to work toward an EU-wide standardized corporate tax base? Because there's no, right from the international perspective, there's no real advantage to having everyone do it at the same time as opposed to just individual member states signing up. And in fact, on some level, right, when the deal was signed, when the framework was set up, I, as an outsider to this debate on some level, was told it's going to be so attractive for individual countries to join, we're not going to have to worry about non-participation. So how should we?
And it's optional, Pillar 2.
So how do you?
Well, I think that it's...
is there an intersection there of broader Commission ambitions and this?
No. I think the proposal to have a directive which applies to 27 countries has legal foundations by having this enter into force as EU law. It offers additional protection. It offers less risk. It offers less administrative burden to companies that apply it across the countries, and therefore it has an advantage. And that's why everybody agreed to that, and that's why everybody has agreed to the text. And as I say, that there is the reasons that it is not adopted yet, as happens sometimes in politics, is not unrelated to the substance of the proposals, but things outside this proposal. Now, there are two ways to look at the alternative scenarios that I have described. They are there, they are all legal, and I think they will, depending on the company you are from and the consequences that you have in the countries you have business with, it might have slightly different consequences. But looking at it simply broadly from a business sitting outside Europe, I think the number of countries that will participate under enhanced cooperation or other things, they will face a situation de facto that Pillar 2 will apply, and there will be one or two or relatively small countries that do not apply it, and then one has to deal with that. So I think this will not stop the application of Pillar 2, and I think this is the most important thing to keep in mind, that Pillar 2 will start being adopted. Ideally, if it is, let's say, recognition of this and working on this with the US, with the business community, I think the result will be better. If, of course, I sense, Kathy, I don't know if I'm unfair, but I say, well, nothing will happen. I don't sense a lot of proposals out of your proposition. So if you solve this, it is a good thing. The business can come and tell us, we need this thing to be solved, and then we will support it. You say, no, nothing will work. Let's all these OECD tax experts work, and we will judge. We will sit back and wait. I think that's what I get from your intervention. It's not what I engaged last year when we came, and you had much more demanding and asking things. That's fair, and say we solve this and then it will go. But here say no. The way that I get is okay. Whatever you do, we are well as we are, and we'll sit back and wait. I think that is a bit troubling. I take it, if it is the view of the business community, I take it is a bit troubling. We have not been used to this, and in Europe, the companies have engaged and tried to help us find solutions, and I think there has not been any particular questions of the objective of what we're trying to achieve. What is happening is this: you have IRA, and the IRA de facto changes your position. So that's how I'm trying to explain the US businesses' position. They say, we have IRA now, certain things have been done, and I'm talking about the business, I'm talking not about Congress, I'm talking about the business. What is why does IRA is it increasing or decreasing your appetite for a global deal? That is my question to you, and if is IRA responsible for your decreasing your appetite for a global deal, I think that's important thing for us to understand, and that's the way that is why we engage in these discussions. We can do it online from Europe, but I think it's better to get a lot of it face to face.
So Kathy, is the answer
can I
yes?
respond?
Yeah.
I think business has been very engaged. Obviously, from all of the consultations that we've had, and be able to put comments in, and to be able to say, these things will work, these things will not work. We've been very engaged with our Treasury Department and the OECD Secretariat, and we've had lots of conversations about what business are doing in modeling a lot of the rules that are being put out, and how certain things will work and certain things just don't work in practice. I mean, they're just practically, they're almost impossible to do, and it's very hard to model. And so companies are trying to put forward all kinds of ideas to try to find solutions, and we're working through that. But we are often running into roadblocks of saying, no, the country's agreed to this. Whether it works or not, they've agreed to this, so we're just going to do it. It's like, but what if we can't do it? And so coming together and listening to each other really matters. And we are running into roadblocks with certain countries saying, yes, you've modeled that, and we understand it's not possible to do some of this stuff, but at the same time, we all agreed to that, so we have to stay with that because it's a tentative agreement. But if it doesn't work, if we are really going to be listened to, then we have to make something that is actually applicable, that companies can do if we're going to be required to comply with certain laws. We actually have to be able to do that. So that's
So we have to reopen the agreement.
well, not reopen it, but at least listen. I mean, businesses putting in comments, look at the comments. If companies from each country are putting the same comments in, this is something that everybody is running into. It is not just a US company issue. When you look at the comments that come in on the consultations, they're pretty consistent across the board,
Yes,
the things that are having problems. It's not just US companies, it's the business community across the world are pointing to the same issues that are problematic and saying which things are working and which things won't work. So we have been deeply engaged. We talk to the Treasury Department regularly, as we do with the OECD, and we work through trying to say, if this agreement comes together, how is it going to work? But they're basically saying some of this is so tentative because it is such a difficult agreement between countries that we can't make some of those changes. Well, is this an open discussion or is this a closed discussion? You're going to listen to us, but you're not going to take any of our issues into consideration. So that is a concern. On Pillar 2, I do think that the U.S. is in a different position because our GILTI rules are not compatible with the GLOBE rules. We have two different bases. We have two different type of rules. What the administration put forward was not compatible with Pillar 2. What they put forward is changes to GILTI. If we're going to make it compatible, we should go to the GLOBE rules. We should adopt the GLOBE rules, we should drop GILTI and go to what everybody else is doing. We signed the agreement, we put it forward. If we're going to do it, we should at least be compatible with what everybody else is doing, and we're not. And so changing GILTI and just doing it country by country adds to complexity, but it still keeps us in a different tax base and in a different place where everybody else is.
I think one reason that's the case is that the Biden administration had multiple goals in reforming GILTI. It was, one, to move towards Pillar 2, but also to raise revenue for domestic spending priorities, and 3, to take pressure off of a corporate rate increase to 28%. So that's why I think it didn't shift all the way to Pillar 2, because I think there would have been revenue loss relative to the proposal that they put forth.
Excellent. Let's take a couple questions from the room before we run out of time. Let's first go over here. Please wait for the mic, and then state your name, say who you are, and questions, ideally, not in the form of comments, but in the form of... Thank you.
Jean-François Wattin with MEDEF, which is the French Chamber of Commerce. Just 3 very quick questions. One to Gerassimos. In the IRA, there are different thresholds for US companies and foreign subsidiaries, US subsidiaries of foreign companies. Is that a problem? Number 2, to Kyle and to Seth, I think I've read that a lot of Republican candidates have sworn that they will get rid of the 80 billions that are devoted to the IRS in the IRA. Is that possible? Is that likely? And my third question is a broader one. That is, it's easy to say we are going to go to USTR, we are going to have countermeasures against countries that treat our companies differently. But I look at countries like India and Indonesia. These are countries that you need to build a partnership against China. So how are you going to try to bring this country closer to you and basically hit them on the head?
Well, let's do question 1 and 2 for sure.
Okay. Now, on the IRA, we are examining the total impact of the IRA, not only on the tax side, on the trade side. You have seen the recent comments of Executive Vice President Vestager. So I think we have not reached internal analysis, maturity in internal analysis, but to make firm policy decisions. There are worries, they have been expressed, and I think we are having bilateral meetings with the US administration to understand and we're examining the different issues. There are worries, that has been expressed, but I cannot be more precise on what exactly are the issues that we will find problematic. I think on your last issue on India, that's what I refer with geopolitics. I mean, we need to have new partnerships around the world, and there are certain areas, if you take steel, for example, where a lot of the products where we have had a heavy reliance on Russia. It was not only, gas that it is hitting the gate lines, but we had a lot in Europe, a lot of steel coming out of Russia, a lot of fertilizers. Things are moving and the supply routes will be redesigned. So it is important to keep the global view, and we cannot judge the economic importance of partner countries with the eyes of last year.
On the IRS agents, any takers?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I could answer. I mean, I think that's going to be a live issue. It's definitely not, certainly not settled. Kevin McCarthy, who aspires to be speaker next year, said, the other day, I think that the first bill he would introduce would repeal the funding for, that was in IRA. I mean, obviously, something like that. If they did that, President Biden would obviously veto it. So that's not going to happen. But there will be continued fights in the annual appropriations cycle over IRS funding, and I'm sure that that Republicans will now be looking to reduce the base funding, and there's just going to be tough negotiations to come. But I do think it is important. The funding in IRA was deliberately designed to be long-term, mandatory funding over 10 years, available to the IRS so that it can sort of get out of this trap where it's only going from year to year, barely, keeping up with the backlog of returns from last year. Anyway, and actually plan for the future on things like the business systems modernization, and also hiring. So I think they can do some of this long-term planning, even as I think everyone's realistic that IRS funding is going to be a live political issue always.
Very good. Let's go to the back.
Mindy Hirschfeld from University of Florida. I have a question for Gerassimos. I hear different things about whether EU member states could unilaterally adopt Pillar 2 without posing a conflict with EU law. So could you clarify whether or not it's definite that a single country or more than one country's adoption of Pillar 2 without an EU directive would or would not be, or could you definitively say that it would not be a violation of EU law?
What can I say is that it is easier to adopt the Pillar 2 as a directive, and that is what we have proposed, and this is the way that we are working to get 27 member states adoption of this text. It is easier for legal, for economic, and political reasons that have to do with the overall objective, policy objective of this OECD tax deal. Enhanced cooperation, the second that I will say, and enhanced cooperation is also, for those of you that do not understand very much the nitty-gritty, it is also a way to adopt an EU legal text through a different procedure.
So what would be the legal concern for individual member states adopting the Pillar 2?
I don't think there is a concern. I think that it is a facilitated way to deal through the directive.
Okay. Let's go over there.
Well, I was going to say, I'm not an EU tax expert, but I think the concern is about the 4 freedoms of establishment, et cetera. There's case law in the EU where the controlled foreign company rules, for example, in the UK, in a Cadbury-Schweppes case, were held to violate the freedom of establishment by taxing another EU member state's resident.
Yeah, so we expelled them from the union.
Yeah, so I think that's the issue, right, Mindy?
Isn't that addressed by exempting real activity? So Pillar 2 through exempting a return to tangibles and payroll is similar to how CFC rules are structured?
Yeah,
in
I
the
think,
EU?
yes, I think it's arguable. I think nobody
Okay.
really knows how the court would come down.
I've seen those arguments made, but I've seen them made in detail by EU legal scholars, which suggests that there is no clear definitive.
Yeah, I think it's unclear.
Sometimes things are unknowable.
I was going to ask, I don't know if people noticed in today's news that the group of 24 put out a statement of their sort of conclusions of meetings they had in connection with the IMF annual meetings earlier this week. Included a paragraph on tax, and I think it was the second sentence of that paragraph said, basically they encourage the use of unilateral measures on, digital business. Now the group of 24 includes 5 G20 members, one of which is going to be the president of the G20 next year, India, and also 2 OECD members. So you have to kind of ask yourself, what does this mean for this so-called agreement on Pillar 1 to repeal unilateral measures? And I'd just be interested if any of the panelists think this is meaningful, or is it just kind of noise in the international political sphere that doesn't really mean much?
I think Kathy gave the reply earlier on in her initial statement that the businesses is concerned about the unilateral measures. They are there, and people do not, from different countries, there is political debate and domestic pressure, and I think it's only the global tax deal that they can calm them down. So I think they do not go away simply because people have technical difficulties in finding other alternatives. So I think we have a good timetable. I think there is the possibility, not the certainty, but there is the possibility with hard work to make this work, the agreement that we have. On Pillar 2, we have agreement, it has been adopted, and then there are some implementation issues, important ones, but can be solved by the end of the year. And in Pillar 1, we need some more work. That's why we gave more time. And if we do that properly, then we will not face all this proliferation of unilateral measures. But they are real, the unilateral measures. You just need to read the newspapers in many countries outside the US and the EU, I think, and to see that they are part of the domestic political debate.
Very good. Let's go up there.
Thank you. Leon Peace. What, if anything, do you see getting done legislatively before the end of this Congress?
I don't think I see anything legislatively in this area in the next couple of months. I think you can make a pretty strong case that these issues are going to be addressed sometime in 2024, 2025, when the United States faces a cliff with respect to both individual and corporate tax policy, and specifically regarding these issues, BEAT, GILTI, and FDII. But right now, I don't see any movement on these issues. If you weren't going to get them in the IRA, I don't think you're going to get them in an extenders package, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's nothing on international taxes will happen at the end of the year. I mean, we'll have to see how the elections play out, but, obviously there's a big lobbying push to further delay the R&E amortization is really the biggest the biggest issue that the business community's pushing forward. So that, that's going to be a live issue in the lame duck. I mean, from my perspective, that was enacted as an offset for the very large corporate rate reduction in 2017, and so it's sort of an instance of having your cake and eating it too. I think if they revisit TCJA and turn off its offsets, they should offset that with other if Congress sees fit to preserve R&D expensing, it should offset that. And then there's an effort to, if they're not going to offset it, to possibly increase the child tax credit as a compromise. So we'll have to see, but I think those issues will be on the table, but it's so hard to tell before the election.
Very good. I think we would have time for one final, very short question. If we do not have a final, very short question, then I thank everyone for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our panelists, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.